If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. This week and every week on Biblical Anarchy, we seek to live counterculture to the empire of man and to instead seek the kingdom of God by unpacking what the Bible teaches about government, authority, and human relationships. I'm your host, Jacob Winograd. So I have for you guys today a snippet from my recent interview with Stephen Wolfe, actually my second time interviewing him and his third time appearing on an LCI program. Stephen and I dive a little bit deeper into our areas of disagreement, although it's still a good-spirited, good-faith dialogue where we are framing it in sort of, if you get to the end of the interview, you'll hear us talk about a lot of the areas where we do find alignment and we think that there's a potential for working together, paleocons and libertarians. But I tried to press Stephen a little bit on how he defines government, on how he views the role of government and what the Bible is in a normative sense when we're talking about government and the role of it, the limits of it, the powers that are delegated to it, and what we can glean from the scriptures. I used 1 Samuel 8 and then kind of the refrain in Hosea 11 through 13, where it mentions again the anger that God had towards the Israelites when they asked for a king. Sort of use that as a sort of springboard to dive into a deeper discussion about where the Bible does fit into this. And so we kind of, you'll hear the very beginning of the interview and you'll hear me get into some of those objections and some of those disagreements, some of my concerns. And then the clip ends around the time that I'm starting the transition into another question about government. And so if you want to then listen to everything else, the rest of that interview, I'll have the link for the full episode in the show notes. But this nice about 30-minute clip here gives you a pretty good introduction and sort of overview of where some of the theological disagreements lie between Stephen and myself. So as always, if you enjoy this kind of content, please go over to biblicalanarchypodcast.com and consider becoming an LCI insider for $10 or more a month. And please like this video, share it, subscribe if you haven't, and as always, leaving reviews, 5-star reviews on Spotify and Apple is always appreciated as well. That's all I have for you guys. Go ahead and get into this clip. It's the second time you and I are talking. We had a group discussion, you, me, and Alex, and then you were recently on Alex's show, which is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. So I don't think we're going to do too much reintroduction or retreading of ground. This is kind of like a part 3 of sorts. And if people are watching this and haven't watched the other 2 conversations, I'd recommend they go do that, because there'll be a lot of defining of terms and sort of uncovering of a lot of the common ground and particulars of your worldview and whatnot in those conversations. So I don't want to, just rehash all of that at the beginning. I feel like, we'll kind of pick up where things left off and kind of just build on the momentum. Before we dive into it, I wanted to see if we agree on the general spirit of the discussion. We have our disagreements for sure, but I've been frustrated that a lot of your critics have been very unfair in their coverage of you, and that's if they cover you at all, because some people will you're like Voldemort to them. They'll just mention Christian nationalists, and you can tell they're kind of talking about you, but they won't say your name. I know when we talked that you expressed there were a couple spots where maybe we misunderstood things you said. But I hope you feel as we get into this conversation that Alex and I have been earnestly trying to understand and represent your positions and engage in good faith. And are there areas where you're surprised, perhaps, of certain areas of agreement or disagreement with Christian libertarians such as Alex and I?
That's a good question. Surprised that there's a agreement. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, in some ways, I'm very sympathetic to old style, I guess, classical liberalism from the founding and the early republic. So I generally speaking want a reduced government. So a small government, a limited government. I just don't in principle think that must be the case. I think that some people, given their circumstances and characteristics, probably need a more heavy-handed government to maintain order. But yeah, ideally, I am for a limited, small government when the people themselves culturally believe in a sort of like an ordered liberty. So I've always said that liberty is the ideal situation, but it must come with order, and that order is essentially brought in by the characteristics of the people and the culture. So I think there's overlap there. I just wouldn't be, I suppose, a sort of limited government, small government absolutist. I just see that as a sort of target that we would want to attain, but not something that's absolutely.
Like all things being equal, you would prefer government be smaller if possible from your position is what you're saying, rather than bigger. But it would depend. And I would agree insofar as that I'm often saying that I do think limited government is something we should pursue in all contexts, but I've always said it, which is similar to what you said this way, that we won't have limited government if we don't have a people capable of governing themselves, of ordering their own individual lives. And so anytime liberals, classical or otherwise, or libertarians try to divorce limited government from personal responsibility and virtue, they're not going to get limited government. You're going to sort of, there's that saying, you're going to get the government you deserve, so to speak. And I think that tends to play out as being what happens.
Yeah, I mean, just even the local level. So I live kind of out in the country in a rural area, and there's building restrictions that the county's placed on us, and some are good, or I'd say most are good for what we want. But I think also that, like, just culturally, there's a sense that it wouldn't be appropriate to build right across the street from me this giant Chevron station with lights going all over the place. So there's also that fittingness aspect. I think for the most part, if we could kind of regulate ourselves as these little rural communities, we would already kind of have a sense of what's fitting, what's suitable without the government. So that's kind of what I mean. It's just sense that what would be suitable, what would be proper given our understanding of our place. And that can be very self-regulated, or you can, actually use government to do it. But it's preferable that I would have the expectation of my neighbor, and he would have that expectation of me, that I wouldn't create a sort of horrible structure that disrupts the neighborhood itself aesthetically, and so yeah.
And I know you also agree that a law has to be enforceable. So there is kind of there is a point of like a critical mass of sorts where if something is, even if you say this is how things should be, well, if too much of the population disagrees, then it wouldn't be prudent to try to force it, even though you might say that it's permissible in the abstract to enforce. And I think a lot of people miss that about your position, that you're often making two statements. You're kind of outlining what can we do and what is permissible, but then you also, make considerations about what is prudent in terms of what is going to work out in the long term. And I feel like even if I disagree with you in some of those calculations, I at least want to give you that credit and engage with what you're actually saying, rather than straw man you as a lot of people will mischaracterize you as a theonomist or as a extreme authoritarian who just wants to put people in power and just immediately pass a litany of laws enforcing a bunch of things that you would probably agree, on day one of if you were starting to initiate a Christian nationalist agenda, they're probably not going to be things that, even if you want to get there eventually, you can't just automatically, poof them into existence and expect them to be enforceable.
Yeah, I think that political life is not, it's not simply a sort of blueprint that you're given from on high that now it's our obligation to just enact it. It's not all theonomists think like this, but some simply think that we have a set of laws and we must enact them, and that's our obligation, regardless of the conditions on the ground. And really, there's no political life at all in that sense. There's just simply a type of social life that with laws that we just follow. But I think politics is far more a matter of deliberation. It's a matter of thinking upon what the conditions are on the ground, and then using different sources for law and ethical principles. So from scripture to just your own experience in the world. Will this work? Will this make things better? Will this make things worse? A good law in itself could actually make things worse because in effect, it produces more evil than good. So the politics is a difficult task of understanding the conditions on the ground, and then sources of ethics and moral principles that you then apply to enact the best possible good given the circumstances. So I think it's more of a human. I mean, it's a divine thing in its fundamental source and origin of principles, but it's also a very human thing of organizing human society to actually bring about actual good. And I think, the theonomists and others, not just theonomists, I would say the way Christians usually think in the modern and nowadays is to think, well, a law is either good or bad, and that's it. And we must enact it without consideration of, the actual effect it creates. That's kind of I think that's a classical way to understand it. It's not just Aristotelian. It's also just the basic way that I think Protestants and Roman Catholics have thought about law and society as a type of human thing informed by divine principles, undergirded in its source by things divine. But then ultimately, it's us deliberating upon the good and enacting what's good for good of society.
That's a good segue into one of the questions I wanted to really ask you about, because we touched on the surface of this, and I want to dive deeper, because I think one of your disagreements with how Alex and I sort of form our political philosophy is that you might think we're pulling too much from the Bible to inform our political philosophy. I think you stated here, if I have the quote right, the Bible is not really aimed at politics, and that these are things that we come to conclusions, based on more considering things like natural law and the study of philosophy and using reason. Although you did also say that, there are certain biblical principles that come into effect as well. Could you touch on where you think, would you describe it as like the Bible maybe establishes certain minimal parameters of, for governance, and then the rest is sort of, we work it out ourselves? Like, how would you formulate that, and what biblical principles, I guess, would be in play?
Yeah, I think it starts with what politics is in itself, which is it's a human thing, like I said before. And the source for the way we order ourselves, whether it's a customs or it's laws, are going to be, it's going to come from our own, it's going to come essentially from reason, experience, and scripture. And ultimately, those are going to inform how we should best arrange and order ourselves. And so, you have to have the experience not only of your own life or your own people's life, but also the lives of people in the past who have also ordered fallen human societies as well. And this has worked, or that hasn't worked, or this sort of magistrate is good, or this sort of magistrate is bad. And we can reflect upon that kind of experience on what'll work. I think reason as well, just trying to understand just both the human nature and also both fallen and good, and also scripture itself. Is scripture, like when you read the Ten Commandments is a summary of the law of God, but that law of God existed prior to the, codification or the inscripturation of that law. The law was prior. You can call it the natural law or the moral law or whatever it was, whatever you want to call it. It's speaking to the same thing. And so when we look to Scripture for ethical or political principles, we have to understand that we're looking at an inscripturated human thing or natural things that are inscripturated, so it's there, we can read it in propositions, and also examples from sacred politics, from First, Second Kings and First, Second Samuel, and you can use that to apply to the circumstances on the ground, to enact the common good. That's how. So in other words, it's a complicated, it's a complex situation of, again, the particulars with these different sources upon which we can deliberate to enact the best possible good.
Sure. So I kind of agree in essence that although biblical, I think biblical principles do play a lot into this. I mean, I think Christian libertarians commonly cite passages like 1 Samuel 8, where God kind of reprimands them for asking for a king, which he later echoes in, I think it's Hosea 11 through 13, where God's sort of speaking through the prophet to be like, here's all the ways you've, I rescued you, I called you out of Egypt, I did all these, things to make you my people, and then you rejected me continually, and I gave you a king in my wrath. And so a lot of Christian libertarians look to that and try to pull a principle out of there of well, maybe God's making a statement to where maybe there's an issue with, instituting too much power into a civil magistrate. Because we would agree, I'm not an anarchist of the type that would say that we should have a society of lawlessness. No, you and Alex covered that actually Rothbardian libertarianism is actually, some people actually, a lot of the left anarchists will say that Rothbardians aren't real libertarians because your system has more rules than the current system, which is, kind of true in a sense, but still we think that power should be decentralized. And if it's centralized too much into one apparatus or person, not only do we have, things from natural law or reason that we could say, there could be an issue there, but there seems to be a biblical principle where God seems to be communicating through certain passages, that if too much power is given to these earthly rulers, that it robs from him, and it's going to lead to, he calls it in 1 Samuel 8, our own enslavement, essentially, that we're going to be, it reminds me so much of what we live in today, right? Where he says that you're going to go fight on the front lines of his wars. And I'm like, well, okay, well, right now we live under the American empire, and our children are often, maybe not drafted anymore, but still they're heavily, coerced and indoctrinated to go out and fight on the front lines of George Bush's wars or Barack Obama's wars or, Joe Biden's wars, right? And they're not actually wars that, you or I would agree with under a, Christian just war theory. And so I wonder, would you agree, at least, maybe in the general view, that there's a sentiment there that we should be factoring, I understand what you're saying. It is kind of this, balancing of different considerations and factors. Would you agree that some of what I just, highlighted here is one of the factors that needs to be at play when we're talking about, what Christians should be advocating for in terms of, political structures and civil life? Yeah.
This is where perhaps there's kind of disagreement where, I think libertarians tend to have I would say it is not theonomist, but is a type of absolutist understanding of of power, so that they want to limit power from the very kind of at the abstract level. Where I would say that actually the civil power ordained of God in the abstract is actually extremely extensive, and but that power then is curtailed through a constitutional order. And I mean, you can see this. This is pretty much the theme of Livy's history of Rome, that it starts off as kings and it goes and it turns into the Roman Republic. And it's kind of a battle between the elites and the commoners to form this constitution that essentially becomes the Roman Republic. And again, that's a kind of experience I mean when we kind of go back and reflect upon political order, and we look at what in the end, what sort of arrangement has then permitted enough kind of robust power to ensure that the good is enacted, but also have a kind of restraints on power to make sure it's not abused. So that's why I think politics in its, I guess, architectonic sense is arranging power so that it can be used for the good. And that's why I think the American founders, this is why they had a sense of power in the abstract, but they said, okay, we got to divide it between executive, legislative, and judicial, and that those powers separate are going to be placed in different branches, and they're going to have checks upon one another. That's just taking political power in the abstract and enacting it through a constitutional order. And so that's what I would say is that we can distinguish between the sort of absolute power, but then funneled through a constitutional order. And that's how I would make that distinction. So I would say, like, in principle or in theory, there's absolute sort of power, not absolute. I mean, there's limits to it, of course, but there's extensive power. But then the job of political order is to maintain an order through which that power is brought about. And we just have, our system is very complex. We have, the federal system, we have different branches of government, and then at the state level, then county. And I think in general, in theory, that is good, or it was good. So I think that would be the difference. Again, I want to place politics at the like, remove it from the theory of abstractions as much as possible, to then place it within the realm of, it sounds silly, but in the realm of the human, like, or on the ground, in human interaction, in the different dynamics between rich and poor, and the dynamics between elite and non-elite, and how those interact, sometimes adversarially, to produce a more just order. So, so I want to take it away from, like, have the theory, have the philosophy, but then also understand the fundamental particular nature of political order. And I mean, and just going back to, like, 1 Samuel 8, I think the problem is, again, you're establishing a monarch over the tribes of Israel, and there really weren't constitutional limits in place except for the law itself, But the idea of having a sort of constitutional monarchy that is, just say, the English Constitution developed, which is someone like Montesquieu would praise and call it a republic, though it's a constitutional monarchy. He called that the true republic, as opposed to France and elsewhere, precisely because it was filtered through constitutional order.
Right. So maybe. So we might still have some disagreement, but there might be an area here where we agree a little bit, and it might be slightly semantic. So let me make clear what I think 1 Samuel 8 would tell us. I don't think that it would necessarily be something that you should read and come away thinking that God doesn't want there to be people who should enact law. I don't even think that it necessarily would condemn monarchy in principle. I think it's two things. One, I think the consideration that you're bringing out is partly true, and I think that's part of God's warning, is that you're asking for a king like the other nations have, and this king isn't going to have the limits. He's going to abuse his power, and he's it's not going to be like you often say that government should be aimed at the good of the people, and what 1 Samuel 8 describes as the king's not going to be enacting what's good for society. But then I think there's also a flip side, which I think you would have to agree that it doesn't necessarily mean that a monarch has to do this, but that there's a tendency for the state to sometimes want to act as a sovereign in society, and to sort of usurp some of the role that God, and maybe to a lesser extent that, like, church should play in society. And so, like, I guess I read 1 Samuel 8, and I just see a lot of corollary to what's happening today, and even different times in history. It's like I can agree with you in a sense that you could conceive of a lot of different political systems that perhaps solve the problem of First Samuel 8. And I agree with you. Like I would say that the libertarian, anarcho-capitalist conception of governance that I happen to be more persuaded by, I think that's a form of governance that, has laws and enforcement of laws in a way that doesn't, wouldn't be something that God would be warning people about like he did in First Samuel 8. And you could probably construct limited monarchs in the same way. And I think even libertarians like Hans Hermann Hoppe in Democracy of the God That Failed have pointed out that there's actually a lot of ways in which there were monarchies that were more limited in their power than the sort of democratic liberal order we live in today. So I can agree with you in a sense there, but would you also, on the flip side, can you agree with me that there is a point where we can use maybe this biblical principle to critique government to say like, hey, it can go too far when the power isn't filtered correctly, and it can go too far if it is being used to claim some sort of sovereignty that isn't due.
Yeah, I mean, if it in principle is violating, if it's doing something it cannot do in principle. So if it's like the classic Protestant, or actually this is just classic Christian example, would be a civil magistrate preaching the word as a preacher, as if a spiritual authority, as if having the sort of the spirit in principle. That would be something that they would violate the nature of civil power itself. So you have to. So there are I think there are limits in principle given what civil power is and what it can accomplish. So I would agree with that. So civil power in principle cannot force you to change a belief. It cannot force you to have an emotion. It cannot force you to fall in love with someone. It can't force you to do these things. And so in principle, it would be a violation of that power. But I just think in principle, civil power is saying do this or don't do that, and it has in an outward sense is not a violation of its power. Now the question is that good or bad? So I think it's a civil ruler calling people up for war to draft them or whatever is in principle a good use of civil power. But if it's to an evil end, if it's to an unjust war, that's a different question. So that's the difference between the power in principle and the power in use.
Make a differentiation between the power itself isn't bad, but if it's used towards bad ends, it's bad. And I guess I would just...
Yeah, it's bad. It would be bad in use instead of... Yeah. So again, like I said earlier, I want to move it away from these sort of abstract principles as much as possible, and then bring that use of power down to the people itself, or to...
Do you think that... Yeah. Do you think there might be a point that centralizing power might... Because I guess it's sort of a spectrum. I don't like using the word spectrum because the left uses it in such a awful way these days. But I feel like, power is sort of a spectrum. And, would you agree that there might be a point of centralizing power where it would lend itself towards the incentive structures would produce more using that power towards bad ends? Because I guess that's where my fundamental, libertarian critique is that it's not that it's actually funny. I was in a debate couple months ago with an Eastern Orthodox Christian nationalist, Andrew Wilson, and he was like, what if we had what if we, had centralized power and only did good things? And I'm like, well, I'm not really if you could conceptualize to me a very, a Christian government that was enforcing only Christian things and doing it in a way that was, not too authoritarian as to, or too heavy-handed as to produce other, undesired ends or, more bad than good, that would be fine in theory. I guess what I have a hard time making the jump in my mind is that it seems to me very unlikely that once power gets centralized to a certain point, or if it's not filtered enough, the way you put it, it feels like you're sort of stacking the deck of cards in the direction of the power will be used towards bad ends. So I guess that's sort of the
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think, in general, the idea that, centralizing power without sufficient checks can often lead to bad outcomes. And so I agree with that. And but again, like that's precisely why the constitutional Western constitutionalism has been so important. And this was actually a very legitimate critique of my book that came out fairly early by a friend of mine, Glenn Moots, who's not only been a friend but a mentor academically, and I haven't always followed his advice, but he's been a good friend over the years, and he's a scholar that does American founding and other things. And his criticism was I just didn't account for enough of Western constitutionalism. And in hindsight, I would have included that, where I said, like if I talk about the Christian prince with all these powers, and that was bound to be misunderstood. But if I had included something about what I've been saying today so far in this show, I think I would have been would have articulated my position better. But so I agree. Yeah, you centralize power with one guy or one group of guys, and they easily devolve into tyranny and bad actors and sort of court people who manipulate them and manipulate power. So I 100% agree. There is a tendency for that. And that's again, not to repeat myself, but why power has to be put through some sort of first law or constitutional law that would then channel that power and to better outcomes than centralizing it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And then we would just, we could have a robust debate over, if constitutionalism, like we have in, our American tradition is the best form of that, or might there be, better filters that might work better, but we would at least agree that there's, the need for, some sort of funneling of power to make it less susceptible for the people in power to abuse it or be likely to use it towards bad ends. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is tricky because like you have this view of governance that it exists pre-fall, which that's something that's a theological debate that would take a long time to get into. I don't necessarily want to debate that, but I think that's what's informing your view, that you think, I think you and I have slightly different definitions of governance, whereas I tend to define it as for more of I'm influenced a little bit more. I think I told you this last time we talked. I'm influenced more by, I guess, like Hyperion conception, where you have the idea of sphere sovereignty, and you have, different spheres of society. And so you have the sphere of the family, you have the sphere of the church, and then I would say there's also the sphere of civil governance. And sometimes when you're talking, and this could be just a misunderstanding on my part, so it's a clarifying question to start out, and then there might be disagreement that follows. But sometimes the way you describe civil governance as being sort of like the functions of civil society and the ways in which we, it's the ways in which people organize themselves, and use it in the way that seems to have a scope that's beyond just the adjudication of law. And so it can almost seem like you're saying that government is not like in the conception that I would have, or a Hyperion reformed would have it, where it's just one sphere, but rather, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like you're saying government is almost a broader sphere that these other spheres sort of, or different parts of civil society fit into, and government is sort of the culmination of all these different ways in which humans cooperate and organize and then, execute different parts of society. Do I have that right, or would you, hash that out a little bit differently?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the terminology of sphere sovereignty. I know that's probably going to rustle some feathers, I guess, but
all right, well, that's it. If you want to hear Stephen's answer to my question, you can go ahead and look in the description here and click the link for the full episode. And I thought that that was a good way to start things out, though, and we got to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time, and kind of give you a little bit of a, and myself too, with a little bit of a further dive into sort of the way that Stephen and other, paleocon, Christian nationalist types think. And while I still have disagreements, I do have respect for Stephen, and I hope to continue this kind of dialogue in the future. So that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed that. As always, please live at peace, live for Christ. Talk to you next week.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.